You're going to need to drown out the sound of the odd vehicle. But apart from that, and apart from the odd road and the odd mast and the electricity wires, not a lot of the landscape has changed, has it? Or the landforms have changed since the day of Christ. And so we're going to read parts of the Sermon on the Mount. So this hillside here that we've walked down with the church on the top is the area traditionally known as the Mount of Beatitudes. Now obviously we don't know that this was definitely it, but somewhere around this area, certainly not far away from Capernaum, is thought to be where the Sermon on the Mount was preached. 1937, not that red roof building, that's a later addition, but the church that we walked down by, there's a domed church. That was built back in 1937 by the Roman Catholic Church. And it's now run by a group of Italian nuns, some Franciscan nuns. So, let's head to Matthew 5. And you've got to imagine this, the disciples, first and foremost, this teaching was to the disciples. His disciples are gathered around him, but there is a far bigger crowd as well, somewhere on these hills around here. We haven't got time to read Matthews 5 through to 7, but you've got some very, very important teaching within the Sermon on the Mount. Salt and light. Are we being effective Christians in living out our faith? Preaches against adultery and murder. He talks about loving enemies. He encourages us to give to the needy. Teaches them the Lord's Prayer. This was where the Lord's Prayer was. It's actually not his prayer, is it? It should really be the disciples' prayer. And I think it's only a prayer for disciples and followers of Christ, which is why when it's said in congregations that are not Christians, at funerals, etc., it's an empty prayer. Our Father in heaven. So you've got all sorts of famous teaching that we're aware of that happened within the Sermon on the Mount, considered to be some of the most profound teaching within the New Testament. And for centuries, this teaching has become important to the church because it sets out the morals and the ethics of the Christian faith. It gives us kind of an outline of how to conduct our lives. So it's even had an impact on the likes of Mahatma Gandhi. He was a big fan of the Sermon on the Mount and even influenced his political approach. The sad thing about Gandhi, in liking the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, I think I'm right in saying he was put off by too many Christians and the way they behave, which is very sad. But Augustine stated this: if anyone will piously and soberly consider this sermon, I think that he will find it in a perfect standard of the Christian life. So every phrase, every verse, and where's Mike Blakely? Is there. I was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount last Sunday. So you might find some of this stuff familiar, Mike, okay? Every phrase and every verse, if we take it to heart, is so powerful and so challenging when we read it. Because we're able to evaluate as to what degree we are really living out the Christian life. Some people have dismissed this teaching as completely unrealistic because of the very high standard of teaching that it sets. And they would say, how on earth can you expect sinful human beings to adhere to this teaching? Others would say, well, instead of applying it to our lives today, it's actually teaching that only applies to the future kingdom. Because the standards are just too high. Other Christians would say, well, yes, the standard is extremely high. We have to remember that Jesus often used hyperbole, exaggeration within his teaching, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., etc. But there is no doubt that Jesus gave this as a standard for all Christians to live up to, realizing that its demands cannot be met in our own efforts or in our own power as sinful human beings. Let me give you a quote from C.S. Lewis. And I did mention this last Sunday, Mike. 1958, there was an issue of a magazine called Christian Century. And someone had the nerve to critique C.S. Lewis. And one of the criticisms that they aimed at him was that he didn't care much for the Sermon on the Mount. This was one of the criticisms. And so this is how Lewis responded. As to caring for the Sermon on the Mount, if caring for means liking or enjoying, I suppose no one cares for it. Who can like being knocked flat on his face by a sledgehammer? I can hardly imagine a more deadly spiritual condition than that of a man who can read this teaching with tranquil pleasure. So many of Lewis's quotes hit the spot, don't they? When you read the Sermon on the Mount, wow, it is extremely challenging. Opening 12 verses, which we'll read in a few minutes, you have the Beatitudes, and some people have referred to them as the beautiful attitudes. And when you read them, that makes a lot of sense. They give us a description of someone with Christ living inside of them. And as we read them, they can be unsettling. They can be challenging. Because you think, well, do I hunger and thirst for righteousness? Am I pure in heart? Do I show mercy? Am I a peacemaker? Am I joyful when I am persecuted for my faith? Then you've got these metaphors of being salt and light on a hillside. And I don't know whether you caught a glimpse last night, when you come outside of Halo Manor near the dining room and you look around the lake, you can't really see much in the day, but during the night you can see towns on the hillside because of their lights. It becomes more evident at night. And so the question is, are we effective witnesses? Are we salt? Are we lights on a hillside to be seen by everyone? Are we such dynamic witnesses? And then if that's not enough, then comes the statement, well, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you'll certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then this is followed by examples of what righteousness should be like. So you've got don't murder, and Jesus takes it even further. Okay, so don't be overcome with a seething anger and resentment. Reconcile with your brother and sister. Don't commit adultery. Jesus goes even further than that, and he says, guys, don't even look lustfully at a woman. Challenging. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. Don't divorce except for marital unfaithfulness. If someone wrongs you, don't fight back. Give to all who ask. Don't turn away someone who wants to borrow from you. And this is challenging when we begin to think about it, isn't it? Almost every line of this sermon, when taken to heart, will flatten us. And as Lewis suggests, who can like being knocked flat on his face by a sledgehammer? So it seems impossible to live up to these standards. especially when we get to this passage which talks about loving our enemies. And it can be discouraging, but it also can be encouraging. The fact that Jesus commands us to live like this suggests that it is possible to do so in his strength. So as we grow progressively in our faith, these characteristics should be becoming more and more evident within our lives, but only as we submit to Christ, and only as we rely on the power of the Holy Spirit within us. Because you and I know that if we try to live out these verses in our own flesh, bang, flat on our faces, time and time again. So this is where we need to say as we read these, Father, I'm well short of these standards. Forgive me and fill me with your Holy Spirit, and may I be open to what your Holy Spirit wants to do in my life in the various situations that I come across.
Yeah.
So let's read a couple of verses.